there's a lot more concern now that that's going to happen. And there's a feeling that, Putin, by his actions in Alaska and by getting Trump to agree not to an immediate ceasefire, could be buying himself more time for those new tactics to pay off for the Russians.
The most read this morning on the Times and Sunday Times app and online is also on Ukraine and how President Putin is demanding that President Zelensky surrenders the Donbas region in the east of Ukraine as the price for peace.
Let's get more on Ukraine now with Mark Urban, the Sunday Times columnist and host of the Crisis Room podcast. Morning, Mark.
Good morning, Callum.
I know you've written for the Sunday Times today about how Putin is exploiting Russia's, huge manpower advantage to play a game of deception that is now hard for the Ukrainians to win. Tell us about that, and I suppose put that into the context of this chapter of progress, hopefully, towards peace. Does it seem like Putin is winning, and that's something we're just going to have to accept as part of bringing a resolution to this thing?
Well, look... There's been a situation there on the front lines for quite a while, say at least a year after the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which was a couple of summers ago. And that was stalemate, essentially. Yes, the Russians were gaining ground, but at a huge cost to themselves, and generally very small amounts, a kilometre here, a kilometre there, that kind of thing. I think things are changing now, and in a way that's causing quite a lot of concern for the Ukrainians and the Westerners who are helping them out with advisors and other things on the front line. And essentially what's happening and has happened in the last few months is that the Russians, they've always had this numeric superiority. They've always had this willingness to just throw away the lives of their soldiers, and the Ukrainians have relied on ingenuity. Determination and inventiveness in the way they defend their land. But things are reaching a more problematic moment now. There's several reasons for that. Firstly, the Ukrainians just don't have the numbers. They've struggled to recruit sufficient soldiers throughout this war. And right now, in those key battlefields that you were mentioning there, in the Donbas, that's the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, mostly occupied, they only manage, the Ukrainians, about 10, 12 soldiers per kilometre of front line. Now, obviously, if you stood them, in a line along a kilometre, well, you'd have to put, 100 metres between them or whatever, or 80. Generally, they're deployed in groups of 3 because you have to have somebody on watch all the time. So if you think about that, what you're talking about with 10, 12 soldiers is 3 or 4 bunkers or positions spaced along a kilometre of front. The Russians have been using infiltration tactics in recent weeks, and this caused this so-called breakthrough early last week, where small groups of Russians managed to make their way through these outposts. Now, the dilemma for the Ukrainian defenders, if they open fire on those small groups, the Russians see their positions. The Russians then take out these positions with guide bombs. 1,400 glide bombs were logged in one narrow sector of the front in Donetsk in 1 month, just leading up to the 11th of August. That's the kind of intensity of fire coming down there. And they also use drones. So the effect of this is if you then punch a hole, you take out 1 or 2 of these bunkers across a few sections of front, you start to make gaps. And that's what the Russians were doing in recent weeks. They've also been using new drone units, which are much more effective. So these developments have got people quite worried because a lot of Ukrainian effort and blood has been spent trying to hold these lines. They have been slowly but surely being pushed back in a number of places, but the rate of loss has not been great. And the Russians haven't been able to make any breakthroughs. But there's a lot more concern now that that's going to happen. And there's a feeling that, Putin, by his actions in Alaska and by getting Trump to agree not to an immediate ceasefire, could be buying himself more time for those new tactics to pay off for the Russians.
We heard on that note, Mark, from Sir Tony Brenton, former UK ambassador to Russia earlier, on the peace deal, which, overarching it is a good idea. Of course, the determination here is to try and find a way towards peace, so fine. But he described it as a shift onto the Russian side of the argument. Would you share that analysis?
I mean, it's interesting the way the issue of a ceasefire has kind of yawed back and forth during this war. If you go back a while, late 22 through 2023, Zelensky was against a ceasefire because he felt that it would stop him regaining those occupied parts of his country. And, in those early months of the war, the Ukrainians were doing quite well. They drove the Russians back from the gates of Kiev. They liberated a lot of Kharkiv province. And then they had progress in the south as well. More recently, Zelensky has understood that things are not going the way of the Ukrainian army. And he's been under pressure from Western friends not to annoy Trump. So while Trump was on the ceasefire bandwagon, so the first part of this year, Zelensky said he was too. Now, was he really, or did he just think, no, Putin's not going to take it up, so I'm not going to have to actually go through with this? Whichever it is, the position has now changed because, as you said, effectively, Trump has now sided with Putin on this question of the negotiations. Putin has said, no, we don't want a ceasefire. We've got to deal with the underlying issues. And of course, those underlying issues are extremely difficult. And therefore, what that will tend to mean is you're going to need a lot more time to negotiate the fundamentals, even assuming you can do that successfully. Yeah. And time is on the Russian side. Yeah. So that's the really difficult position that comes out of this summit. And obviously with Zelensky going to the White House tomorrow, we're going to get a sense of whether not only has Trump, sided with Putin on this issue of ceasefire sooner or later, but whether he also puts pressure to concede some of that territory in the east of Ukraine.
Yes. And I want to ask you about this too, because I just felt, reading around this morning, that there's almost an unshakable, developing, growing consensus that actually this is just the inevitable result of war, that somebody who invades in the way Putin has and occupies land, comes close to conquering whole regions and areas, that actually the reward, in inverted commas, for the invader is that they keep the land. That is the tale as old as time itself of war. That is the purpose of what Putin has been doing here. And so any peaceful outcome and resolution will result in him keeping some of that. There is just an inevitability, and is now the time for that to be accepted, primarily by Zelensky, also by his allies and supporters. Are we at that point?
Good Lord. Well, when you say it's a tale as old as time, oddly enough, I've just done a video for the Times YouTube channel about the rules, the so-called rules-based order. Now, broadly speaking, between the end of the Second World War and, well, when would we judge it? Maybe 2014, when Putin moved his people into Crimea and annexed Crimea, part of Ukraine as well. The accepted principle was you don't solve territorial disputes by force. In a way, that was the big learning of the Second World War, that if you let someone like Hitler get away with what was going on in the late 1930s of gobbling up bits of his neighbors that he wanted to take over, you're going to have just a bigger war, a bigger conflict. And so for a long time after the Second World War, certainly as far as the superpowers were concerned, there were wars in parts of the world. Those were the rules. Now, when you say a rule as old as time itself, it is clearly right that historically countries grew or lost territory through conquest, defeat, all the rest of it. I think the big problem for the Ukrainians, and this has been evident since the failure of their counteroffensive, which is actually pretty much 2 years ago now, is that they cannot retake those lost lands. So that's about 20% of Ukraine that's occupied by the Russians. The Ukrainians have lost a lot of soldiers too, not nearly as many as the Russians, but, there are some estimates that say that The Ukrainians have lost more than 100,000 soldiers trying to defend their country and trying to regain the lost areas of the country. So this idea of, well, are those two key districts, Luhansk and Donetsk? Luhansk is pretty much all occupied by the Russians. Donetsk is largely so, and it's the rest of it. It's the kind of unoccupied part of that province that Putin is now demanding as part of his negotiating position. But the Donbas is largely gone. So that is the terrible question for Zelensky. Does he accept that as a fait accompli? Ukrainian public opinion is still strongly against that. If he accepts it in talks, does he basically finish himself politically? And is there a way of kind of trying to sort of square the circle there? So, for example, he doesn't have to accept that Russia is now the sovereign power in those two parts of Ukraine, but simply the fact that they occupy those two parts. Would that be enough? Would it be enough for him to accept a sort of 99-year Russian occupation of those parts of Ukraine? Those are the sort of formulas that the diplomats have been trying to get traction with in recent months. That the basic fact contained in your question, that those provinces are gone and the Ukrainians don't have the means of reconquering them by military force, is a given.
Mark, it's so fascinating to speak to you. It's always great to hear from you and to watch you, indeed, on the Times YouTube channel and to read your analysis in the Sunday Times. Thank you so much for joining us.